Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I will have a conversation with my great friend Trent. Hello, Trent.
Everybody, this is Chen, your friend. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. Great to be with you all today here.
Great. So, what we have talked about in the past few episodes has been centered around evolutionary psychology. We have worked extensively on especially the beginning chapter of adaptive mind that basically lays foundation of the discipline called evolutionary psychology. It is written in the 90s, but it's still the same principles applies to evolutionary psychology today. We have spent the last few episodes delineating the principles of evolutionary psychology and juxtaposing it in relationship with what they call the standard social science model and how it wants to in some ways supplant and dysfunctional structure in understanding human behavior and human nature. We also spent the last episode talking about the possible challenges that exist that are preemptively addressed in adaptive mind in various chapters, and we just selected a couple of those issues to talk about. And those issues were basically trying to find some deviations in human behavior, and then kind of showing us why that deviation is not actually a deviation, is an expression of an ancient psychological mechanism. So if you're interested in knowing more about what the adaptive mind is about and what the principles of evolutionary psychology are, you can watch those episodes. In this episode, we want to talk about how we look at evolutionary psychology and critically assess some of these principles that we have discussed. I think on my part that as much as the criticism that I'm going to present on my um, uh, side of the argument are going to be harsh, I think there is definitely value in evolutionary psychology, and there is definitely some aspects of the principles that evolutionary psychologists present that need to be answered and not just like dismissed based on just like some self-righteous attitude of social scientists and philosophers of like, natural scientists are just reductionists, therefore we don't need to engage with them. Definitely not. I think there are very important points that are presented by evolutionary psychologists, and some of those I think are going to be incorporated in our own account as we are together developing that account of human nature. Before getting into that specific, we're going to talk about the specific points that we find some not just flaws, but like uh, points of dispute that are worth mentioning. I want to see Trent. Do you have anything to add to this summary?
Yes, I'm not really adding to your summary. I just want to second your overall evaluation about the whole book. I think I benefited a lot from reading the first chapter, at least. Especially, I see a lot of merit in its criticism of the standard social science model because they really point out certain unexamined disciplinary habits, how, say, cultural anthropologists shy away from engaging with like psychological theories or like ecosystem stuff like that. Um, I think we both of us that are more appreciative of the critical points it raised than the answer, the overall picture it provides. So I think it's time for us to dive into the concrete points where we take issue with their grounding principles or assumptions about human nature. Yeah.
Yes. I think the way I think that we can start this conversation, and for those of you guys who've been with us in our past episodes, some of these issues are just being echoed again here, as like we also witness similar issues with other thinkers, especially in the tradition of evolutionary biology and the inquiry over human nature. And by each kind of engagement, I think we get to at least like new layers of the problem that we are dealing with. Uh, One of those problems that is a recurring problem, and it's very interesting. It's a recurring problem for people who are like very much invested in biology and evolutionary biology, is a very just easy dismissal of the relevance of the problem of speciation, right? The problem that identification of what we are is just a given. Let's just go ahead and characterize who we are. Right? This is particularly fascinating to me because there is another side of evolutionary biology that is very much focused on the problem of speciation, and is a very much a contested field. Like there is no consensus over like what is the way to go about, demarcating the boundaries between the species in nature, right? And or is there any way to kind of like uh, isolate the species from one another in a very kind of um, as if they have their own nature and they're just thrown in a world. So in fact, it's a very kind of a creationist viewpoint for me. That to think that okay, human beings, here are human beings are. Let's throw them to the fields. Here are like these species of mosquitoes. Let's throw them to the field, right? And there are like numerous ways that this could go very much wrong. First of all, there's been like people claiming that like these like these human beings are not really human beings because of so and so reason. So there is definitely like people who are having that problem. This especially is also like a especially problem with evolutionary psychologists because they think these ancient mechanisms are like developing during a time that the interspecies breeding is also to an extent happening. There are different categories of um, Homo species. In that way, I think there is something also relevant to be said about the same kind of a problem that is not just about the speciation in the sense of identifying where does humanity begin and where does it end, but also from a different direction, an ecological concern, right? Like that there are going to be people who are going to argue that understanding human nature, which is, by the way, just simply assumed as something existent in adapted mind. There's no like it just starts it begins that okay, it's clear who are human beings. Here's their nature, right? There could be like a very strong problem with that from someone who wants to think about humanity in terms of like the bacteria that like the gut bacteria, right? That we are not this kind of a species that is on its own detached, is something existent and suddenly comes to relations with other species. But what our species is is determined by that kind of a relationship with other species. And that creates a completely different vision of what our quote unquote nature is. So it's in fact a very evolutionary psychology is a very kind of a mentalist, like a mind related, a very isolating kind of a structure, isolating in the sense of isolating our species from other species and assuming that's just like a given, and that is not a given.
Yes, yes. I was thinking when I was thinking about the question of a speciation. I'm a historian. I think of speciation in a historical process. So I've kind of two questions related to this. One is to what extent are they providing a theory of or method of description, or to what extent are they providing a theory of identification? Because when we were discussing Graham Ramsey's book on human nature, he was very clear from the very beginning. That was it's a matter of identification. It's a matter of description. It's not a matter of identification because we already know what human beings are. But for Gordon Ramsay, it was more defensible or more coherent. You can disagree with him, but it's at least coherent because he's taking a more or less a historical view. But for evolutionary psychologists, like they have evolution in their title, and they are, especially in their empirical studies, they're trying to remind us a lot of the stuff we carry with us that really were formed or really reflecting the hunter-gathering period, which is like 5 million around years ago, that period. And if we come up with a theory of description of what we are now, does that mean that description has the prescriptive value for the coming 5 million years? And like, so how do you mirror like past into the present and the future? So I think I very much agree with you in the sense that this acceptedness of what human beings are at this moment, once it's projected into the past and projected into the future, it becomes really problematic because you can use that to like exclude people who are in like maybe I don't know like 50,000 years from now on having certain really important different psychological mechanisms which differ from the mainstream. Are they not human beings anymore just because they don't conform to the same human nature? Is it in the same way because a lot of hominid species that were still alive even just 50 or 10, 100, 1,000 years ago, much, much shorter than the end of the classical period in East Africa they studied. But they were not a part of the story because we're taking a survivor's bias here in describing what does it mean to be human. So yeah, that's what I have to say about the question of speciation here. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, the possible defense that like evolution psychologists may provide is that no matter when this started, what we can go ahead and kind of like specify is that these are the psychological mechanisms that are just define this line. But as you're going to see, and a lot of our criticism are just kind of like be along the same line is that if we that seems to be if you say that everyone who wears red is a so and so, right? Then if someone shows up and is not wearing red, then they don't belong to that category of red people go to this house, right? But then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that we can start excluding people who don't have that thing that we identify as the key to go to this house, as they didn't belong there anyway. You see, like I think it's just like it really sets itself for this kind of a self-selective bias that we already know that the people who have these psychological mechanisms are human beings, right? Okay, so what about this group of people that did not have that characteristic? Well, evolution psychologists have different strategies to deal with that, but I think it becomes rather inevitable at some point to just say that, oh, so therefore they cannot be part of this line that we call human beings. But that just only happened because of that original decision to differentiate based on those specific characteristics, right? So the question is not so much, or the issue is not so much whether the identification that evolutionary psychologists do is valid or invalid, or to what extent is valid. The question is, why is this not a problem for them?
Right.
Right? Why they think this is just warranted to just say that, okay, we know what human beings are, we know they have a nature, and here's what their nature is. That seems to be incongruent with a very sound biological doubt about strong borders between the species, both from a historical sense and an ecological sense. Now, the second category of problems that we have is basically, I mean, this is something that kind of is a recurring theme as well. And we are naming it that way may not be that helpful, but it's a set of like awkward dichotomies that starts to pop up here. And the problem with this kind of dichotomies is not just they are dichotomic and they don't have the exact same problem either, right? But these specific dichotomies cause problems. One of those dichotomies that they seem to really hold on to is a dichotomy of processor information. Now, what matters here for me in this specific distinction is that for them, the processor, which is the brain, receives information and it has a process to go, it processes it, and then there's an output, right? It's a function that receives A and gives out B, right? Other than the problems that are going to be about deviation, variation, we're going to talk about later on, one thing that is very interesting to me is that no information in this model can change the processor itself. Or to put it a little bit more mildly, and maybe in a way that is more defensible, it takes a transformation of information for the processor to change, right? Hence, this kind of a rigid stability of the psychological mechanisms in humanity, right? So, for evolutionary psychologists, no information in the context that we're familiar with, right? In the concept of information as cultural exchange, information as some form of, spiritual experience, information as knowing something new about, the music of a tribe in the Amazons, right? No information does anything to change the processor, right? And as I think a very kind of a Kantian structure, there is a very strict distinction between a priori categories and a posteriori and the data, right? They're empirical data, but the apparatus that processes them and puts them together and structures them is going to be this exact same thing. The difference is, though, for Kant, these processes or this processor is only doing something very, 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 very basic, right? It's making experience in general possible, right? And in the case of evolutionary psychology, that seems to be not enough. They think these are doing a lot more than that. That they are content specific and they are reacting, the processor is reactive to a specific context and a specific problems relevant for the species that we are. Why? Like, why is this processor is thought to be this rigid? And part of like this point is like an empirical question, right? Has it been that rigid? Right? But I'm not sure if I buy this idea that the brain is interacting with the information, and there are not in that basic sense, these examples are not to refute that basic structure, but there are definitely ways that like one's brain changes, like the neural network that exists in one's brain are dependent on all sorts of things. Now, I'm not sure why there is this hyper emphasis that the processor is unchangeable. Again, I think partially this is not a theoretical or like in an abstract way philosophical question. This might be a question that we want to ask about, ask from people who know about the development of brain. But that is a very kind of like, if you change that part of the story, that there is some information that can change the processor, then the whole thing collapses. Because you cannot appeal to the processor as human nature if information can change the processor. Trent?
Yes. Yeah, I have nothing to add about your processor and information, so just move on to the next pair of dichotomy. The name of information also comes here, but it's contrasted with matter, and this dichotomy works in a way that is quite different from what Aaron just talked about. So if you look at a human community or a human individual to exist, to survive, to procreate, you need two, at least, that's the impression you get from reading this book. You need two process to work harmoniously in parallel. One is a set of information system. The other is the material exchange system. With the material system, like a group hunt and collect fruit and procreate themselves organically. But information system is really the core, according to them, because like a human mind is nothing but a cluster of information processing mechanisms. So if you're requiring these two to work together, then the fundamental law of the information and the fundamental law of matter or physics must be congruent. But there is no guarantee of that. You might one day have a different theory of matter that contradicts with the specific theory of information used in evolutionary psychology to understand the human behavior. So how do we make sense of that? And also, it's very interesting, even though they are not genetic reductionist or they do not just prioritize the rule of genes in the story of human evolution over other things. But it seems genes are quite essential here in the way they bridge everything in my eyes, because the genes are at the same time a coding system, like as information, it preserves and transmits information across generations. Parents share their genes with their kids, yada yada yada. On the other hand, genes are also material objects in the sense that they observe and obey the physical law. So they somehow play the role of both information carrier and they are also material. Therefore, kind of things are like better synthesized and through this linchpin, which the divergence between information and matter might be stark if we go to a more grander level or looking at actual human behaviors. You will see a divergence there. So yes, I think with this pair of abstract terms, what I try to emphasize is that this system, in its evolutionary psychology, in its pursuit for unity, has a fundamental assumption about the parallel existing realm, planes of a causality, which make this whole organic system function perfectly, needs to be needs to be congruent with each other. Whereas this is, in my eyes, an assumption, not really a like guarantee from the system itself. Yes.
Yes, and I think the conflict that we're dealing with here is, I mean, we're going to talk about this in a moment, but like how much of a reductionist an evolutionary psychologist is. But yes, I think it's interesting that they are um, they are interested in information processing, right? But the way that they are thinking about information processing is not necessarily something that I would think. Okay, the example of the genes is very interesting because of that kind of a coincidence between like matter and information. I just don't see that there is a serious engagement between like the serious engagement in evolution psychologists in kind of trying to see what is the relationship between the two. This becomes a problem for me when we start talking about that reductionism. I think that for me, it plays out really well when we talk about that because you can say that information is nothing but matter, right? Information is nothing. It's just like a name that we have put into, just like we have named something a chemical bond, right? And we have named some physical, you know, organization as black hole, right? We have called another form of physical configuration information, right? Or we can say that there is a realm of information that is kind of sui generis and you can analyze it on its own. And it doesn't matter whether matter is grounding it or how matter is grounding it. It has its own laws. I remember that sociologist that we mentioned, I think Lovi was his name, that like, the for someone who's interested in architectural styles, the law of gravity doesn't have anything useful to say, right? And I think in some ways the same problem um, in a weird way. It's not about architectural styles and gravitation, but in the sense of like how much the science of matter will be relevant to the science of information. I think that's a question that is not clearly answered in evolutionary psychologists. The relation between the two. But with that, I think when we get to the reductionism part, um, I think we can talk more concretely about that. The last thing I wanted to mention, and then see Trent what you have to add, is that there is this kind of a mind-brain duality that is a lot more like mind is just brain kind of an attitude. Um, that even in terms of like evolutionary past, the unit of selection or just the development is development of mind, but then mind is just basically this brain. Like I think there is this very interesting assumption in evolutionary psychology that it's about this. It is like the locus of what is significant in humanity is in one person's brain. Right? And I think we don't have time to like expand on an alternative approach um, to evolutionary psychology. I just want to point that mind is a notoriously complex concept in the sense that, for instance, we can ask a question of whether mind is not some form of an achievement that requires more than one person's existence. Any infant has brain, right? But if you leave that infant and give it food without communicating with it in a in a jungle, right? How much mindedness exists in that person um, is a question, or how much the development of that brain and the particular path of development of a brain depends on a specific types of socialization that itself is absolutely like forgotten in the analysis. And this is important to that kind of a very basic point about processor versus information, right? Because I think if if one's brain and the way that one's neural system works and functions is dependent on the type of socialization one is exposed to, right? And that's a hypothesis. But if that is something that we can show that there is a categorical difference between someone's brain that is like a feral kid that with no social contact versus someone who has gone through a specific type of socialization, if there is the difference between these brains, just like there is a difference between the brains of people who have PTSD versus the people who don't have PTSD, right? If we can show that, then I think that a space of mindedness, a space that like my mind shows itself, um, is gonna be in a different relationship than a given brain. You see, the brain itself is gets related to um, other brains, and other brains together create a mental space that is not just in someone's head as a given, but is out there between them as much as it is inside them as an achievement, right? So I think the point that the evolutionary psychologists want to say that okay, mind is just like the brain. It's not even like we don't need to go that far. Like think about embodied cognition, right? Think about the body, right? The rest of the body as something relevant for for mindedness, right? And I think that is just absolutely just not acknowledged. It's left completely unacknowledged that there is anything relevant about making this distinction clear. And we just go as if brain, mind, whatever. That seems to be the attitude. Trent?
Yes, I think what you said, I think that really helped me to find the vocabulary to say what I try to say with the DNA thing. Is I think what really unites my struggle with the DNA, your struggle with mine, is a matter of self-sufficiency. That like the stuff evolutionary psychologists identify as the locus, according to their theory, must combine both information processing capacity and material reproduction. Hence, and if because they are so obsessed with the importance of mind, therefore, like we need to find its counterpart, namely brains. However, the neither, first of all, is a self-sufficient. Mind requires socialization, communication, stimuli, and brain is a part of a human body, and it could not sustain reproduce itself without other body part. And the stuff I would try to say was the two planes of inferences is really so how did one human mind interact with other human mind or other parts of the information system? And how does a human brain, say, interact with other organs? Do they necessarily use this, have the same, say, boundary of environment? Like if my information system is really I don't know, say 1 mile radius away from me, that's a spherical, like a space in the sense that I couldn't detect anything beyond it. Whereas my whole body through like oxygen exchange is really exchanging with something much beyond. So how do we account for the discrepancy between the two? Or do we need a kind of a very neat symmetry between these two planes at every level as if they were like genes. So that's why I think genes has a specific status in their whole system. Uh, Not necessarily they are genetic reductionist, but because their treatment towards the desire to force multiple mechanisms like information processing and material producing into one holistic system, which they call human nature, which includes both brain and mind, requires them to explain the question of consistency. Does every individual mechanism need to fulfill something closer to a gene, or is the gene just unique in that whole picture? And or is their mind just unique in their whole picture? Yes. That's my response.
Yes, and I think that that's actually a good way to kind of bridge it to the last point, because I think what you mentioned in some ways gets to the question of like, remember that one of the main tasks of evolutionary psychology is conceptual integration and conceptual consistency, and kind of like getting rid of these disciplinary boundaries that they think they don't really make any sense, right? And to an extent, we appreciate that. Like, they really try to kind of like expand and connect. But if you are doing that without kind of, because there is like one very important thing that, if you're thinking about information spaces or sui generis, and understanding their logic requires like certain axioms, certain methods, and analyzing matter requires a completely different structure and methodology. uh, then that's one thing. If you want to say that no, 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 this is all consistent, then you have a number of options to say that it's consistent. One of which is to say that there are consistence in this, just very broad way of like thinking about, basic, um, you shouldn't make claims in the information system that goes against the laws of matter. And sometimes evolutionary psychologists talk about it that way. But there are some other times that they say things that imply something else. So let me actually start from that example to just kind of get into this point of like why we think that there is some form of half-hearted reductionism there. So one of the things that we discuss is that for evolutionary psychologists, the concept of learning is a pseudoscientific concept, right? They think that what we call learning, which also involves like, learning, not just like learning a language, but learning, social behavior, is like an ether-like concept. It doesn't really correspond to anything real. It is just like a garbled, meaningless concept that will be exchanged. We will just get rid of it. We will supplant it by a causal story about psychological mechanism unfolding. Right? At least that's my interpretation of why learning is a mythical concept. Like, learning is the mythical concept because this is all about this kind of like cause and effect going on. So now something else is happening, right? It's like that kind of whole system of information processing in like in that case through learning is not information processing through learning. It is this other thing that is just very basic cause and effect of like one ball hitting another. Now, like the reason that there is a half-hearted reductionism is that for evolutionary psychologists there is one side of reductionism that is great, which is that cultural phenomena are fundamentally biological phenomena. And every behavior within the cultural space is actually biological behavior. And that biology is not just about my organism thrown into the world, it's about my evolutionary past. So every cultural phenomena is about my evolutionary biology side, right? So anything about culture must be kind of subsumed under the metaculture, and that metaculture is nothing but the psychological mechanisms as adaptations develop through our evolutionary past. Okay, so in that sense, they want to say these kind of like information analysis, symbolic analysis, whatever, ritual analysis, all of these has, insofar as they are not thinking of themselves as information processes reducible to the basic information processes through psychological mechanisms, evolutionary design psychological mechanisms, um, unless there is that kind of a reduction, those are all nonsense. Okay? Who? But why not go further than that and think about the whole psychology and the whole concept of information as something that is collapsible to a more basic uh, analysis of physics, right? Because someone could say that psychology itself is an absurd discipline because so when we think about psychology, we're talking about ultimately biochemistry, right? There's no the fundamental difference between that biochemistry and any other like space that we go and like witness biochemical interactions, right? So psychology, behavior, mechanism of like psychological mechanism, even like adaptation, like all of these become like very anything that involves this kind of a process or information structure, um, that also collapses. The difference between process or information becomes meaningless too, because both of them are just like collapsible into cause and effect structures. Like think about someone who is a kind of a staunch physicalist or like a reductionist. So if I tell that person that hey, like there is uh, agency and there's lack of agency, right? And there's like agency in the way that like I kind of make decisions, and there's lack of agency when things just unfold. That like kind of a determinist reductionist would say agency is just a phantom concept. There is no such a thing as agency. Agency is as much about chains of cause and effects as hitting the ball and the ball moving is a cause and effect, right? Agency is a myth. So psychology is a myth. Why are we stopping there? Let's go all the way, right? Or if we don't want to go all the way, where is the argument that we should stop here? Because the culture, the Kulturwissenschaftler would say that, we should stop at a different level, right? That there is a meaning to talk about information, processor information, or like the information processing strategies that are very culture specific, and we can speak of different forms of learning. We can talk about all those. Okay, so they say that you say that's a myth. Why? Because we can reduce all of that to these basic information processes, and those are all just the cause and effects that are badly named. Why not thinking about evolutionary psychology as a badly named discipline? That it really is not um, representing anything real. Now, in that regard, one thing that I think is just it's also the same kind of a problem applies to why we're talking about psychology instead of talking about genes, right? Because there's going to be that layer of reductionists too that forget about like like this is about like proteins, and cells, like everything that is psychologized, that's it's not really representing the reality of the world, right? Um, it's just about like these kind of like very, 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 very basic, um, like decoding and uncoding and reproduction of certain proteins in cells. Again, this all goes back to the question of human nature, right? That would really dismantle the idea of human nature. Not only dismantle the idea of human nature, dismantles the idea of, species. This is all badly named physics. This is all incomplete physics, right? What is stopping evolutionary psychologists to go there? Because they're already moving in that direction, but they're stopping suddenly. And when you say that, no, 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 this is fine. And one last thing that I want to say here, and then we go to Trent for final thoughts on this point, and then we move on to the next episode, is that with that type of a reductionism, with any form of reductionism, we can say there is this kind of a very awkward position that we find ourselves in, that I think it is in some ways both applicable to the full-hearted reductionists and the half-hearted reductionists. It's not so much about reductionism, it's not about much about, sorry, half-hearted or wholehearted. It's about like a form of explanatory reductionism that ultimately runs into I think, a logical problem. Because if we want to say that, if we want to uh, accept some form of explanatory reductionism, what we're saying is that whatever is happening in this other domain is explainable within this other domain, and anything that wants to say there is a sui generis analysis of that domain is just empty, right? Cultural analysis of behavior is empty because the behavior within culture is nothing but manifestation of psychological mechanisms, right? So let's get rid of it. Now, if we take this kind of to the core of the problem, we get to the point that symbols are nothing but just physical processes, right? So every question about meaning and communication is explanatorily reducible to physics. Now, of course, we can interpret this point about explanatory reductionism in two different ways. Number one, that means that we can explain what is happening in one's brain when they interpret something's meaning. The other way is that the category of meaning, communication, language, agency, society, all these are just like bad science. These concepts do not really represent anything real, and they could collapse into an explanatory reductionism of physical sciences. But of course, that begs a very important question, which is physics is the symbolic system itself. Like the refutation of validity of symbols beyond physics is a symbolic claim, right? And that self-referential problem haunts different forms of explanatory reductionism. In any case, I think in the case of evolutionary psychologists, the problem is that they want to get rid of they want to be explanatory reductionists on the one side, but they want to stop there, and it's unclear why. And there are going to be not that type of a hardcore problem with explanatory reductionism, but there are going to be similar problems with evolutionary psychology when it comes to the meaning of its explanatory reductionism. We're gonna talk about that in the next episode. But I'm gonna stop. I'm done. It's all yours, Tran.
All right. I just want to highlight on one point. I think what you said is great, especially like how they reduce everything. If we are trying to envision a hierarchy of knowledge, they try to reduce everything above psychology down to the plane of psychology and refuse to further class. So they just like remove the top, basically. I think even if we grant them their wish. Like we agree everything about that halfway reductionism. There is a problem of self-contradiction between that and human nature because there's no human or speciation, as you say. Everything they say about how natural selection, a new Darwinian framework, could inform our understanding of human nature, we can apply that to any other human social animals or animals kingdom in general. In the sense, are they just providing not a pan-human metaculture? Are they providing a pan-animal metaculture in the sense that we're all dealing with the same problem in the sense we're dealing with procreation and we're dealing with information processing. We're trying to better configure our biological or physical apparatus with the information extracting and the framing um, um, mechanisms. So like that reduction from culture to psychology does not sit with their received boundary between human and non-human animals. So that's, I think, concludes our first episode.
Yeah. Let me just say something, like, because I think that the kind of like that we made a full circle. Like the problem that you mentioned is that, like, goes back to the problem of speciation. But like I think the problem of speciation is about create like the problem of boundary making, right? And if that boundary making is just, um yeah, that boundary making problem like repeats itself in that kind of a collapsing of the hierarchy of knowledge to psychology, but not psychology to the basic point. One last thing, and then I think we should end this, is that the others like point is that the evolutionary psychologists keep saying that what we want is consistency between sciences, right? Whatever you arrive at as like, inquiry in biochemistry shouldn't be in conflict with the findings of physics, right? Which is fine, right? And I think one of the ways that they want to kind of reply, they might reply to what we were just saying, is that no, we are like paying attention to that kind of a other side. Like we are thinking that we need to be consistent with physics, right? But we also think that to understand humanity, we need to kind of also stay at this level, right? We need to be consistent, but we are also sui generis in like an analysis of human behavior. But then why not then go back to the cultural analysis and say that the cultural analysis also are saying the exact same thing? They're not saying that they want to be inconsistent with the laws of physics. They want to say that there is something about what they're studying that makes them stand where they are actually standing, makes them not want to collapse more based on what they're actually studying. So the evolution psychology to me has both problems either way. If it says that our what we mean is reductionism in the sense of explanatory reductionism of going to the most basic like structural knowledge physics, then there is no such a thing as psychology. Or they want to say that we are only thinking about consistency in the sense that like things shouldn't disagree, and this broad sense of consistency between disciplines. Then a cultural anthropologist could say that, hey, I'm not even consistent with like so and so, but I still have a sui generis like domain of knowledge that shouldn't be collapsed to yours. Um, in both cases, there is this kind of an unresolved tension. Um, so if you don't have anything to add, Tran, or do you? You good? So we can end this episode. We have a couple more critical remarks to share with you. We have left them for the next episode so that this doesn't become too long. So until then, take care of yourselves. You will hear back from us very soon.
All right, stay attuned. More critical remarks on the adaptive mind are coming up.